Today, we share these stories of our history, those less proud moments, so that collectively we share an understanding both of times when our faith compelled us bravely to take risks we are now proud of, such as the story of the origin of the chalice as a symbol of our faith, as well as an understanding of when our fears trumped our faith and we missed the mark on living into our values. Having a shared understanding of all of these helps us to find grounding and clarity as we face our own difficult decisions and moments now and in our future, as individuals and collectively as a fellowship. In the months to come and years to come, as we discuss our values, we'll be looking back at how we can proudly see our commitment to these in our history. And so today we take a moment to ground ourselves in these less proud moments too. For they too are a part of our faith's shared history, and they too can be grounding and motivating as we look to our past to find strength in our present. There is, as we all know, so much going on in our world right now. And there is also so much history that could be highlighted. Often, I and others who preach or teach or speak, when left with a choice of breadth or depth, choose depth, as highlighting a story and reflecting on this one story is most illustrative and speaks to our hearts and minds most effectively. In this day, and in our context, and in this topic of less told and sometimes less proud stories in our history, it seems important to touch on several stories. And so I will do my best to respect your time, but also have a bit of breadth with some depth. We begin. And Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt's message to her fellow Unitarian Universalists that I read as a prayer for us this morning, she named that as a whole community of Unitarian Universalists, we have not engaged the Israel-Palestine issue for a handful of years. And when we did, it resulted in severed relationships and deep pain. Reverend Dr. Betancourt was here referring to when we gathered at General Assembly and voted on a resolution. For an explanation on what a resolution at General Assembly is, as many of us have no clue what that means, we turn to Executive Vice President of the UUA, Kerry McDonald, who also issued a writing, his to UUA staff, regarding our UU histories of engagement on this issue. He writes, public statements of the UUA on societal issues are based on votes of delegates from our member congregations at the annual General Assembly. While there have been a number of historic statements adopted by the General Assembly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including a fairly comprehensive resolution in 2002, recent votes have been fraught and a number of proposed statements have failed to pass. Debate around a business resolution related to boycott, divestment, sanctions of Israel in 2016, which did not pass, in particular was harmful to many UUs with different perspectives and identities. We contain, as Unitarian Universalists who are Jewish and Muslim, Israeli and Palestinian, and those of many different nations in the Middle East. We contain those, in fact, Unitarian Universalists who are Jewish and Muslim, who are committed to liberation for Palestine, and those who are committed to the state of Israel. And tension increasing in recent years around this issue in Unitarian Universalism is indeed one of our less told, but now needed to be faced stories. We will link to a full history of public statements brought to and adopted by the UUA and the What's Up later this week for those who want to read more about stances Unitarian Universalists as a collective have and have not taken as a denomination over time. For now, we will move on to some other topics, but my hope is that on this issue, we may each proceed thoughtfully, as the president of our denomination so beautifully modeled for us. May we honor the trauma of war and occupation, of generational trauma that few amongst us have experienced to the extent that those involved in this war have. And may we do our own research, both of facts and information and our own pain that surfaces while we engage in thought, conversation, and action. We stay abroad, but we move to Unitarian Universalism abroad in particular. Now, as a faith that does not like the word evangelism and does not consider itself missional, too often we do not have on our minds that Unitarianism and Universalism and Unitarian Universalism are beliefs that are held in many places, and that indeed there are Unitarian Universalists living in every continent except Antarctica. We turn today to the Philippines and segments of an article written for our denomination's magazine, UU World, by Reverend Joseph Santos Lyon, an American minister currently living and serving in the Philippines. He writes, Unitarian Universalist Church of the Philippines founder, the Reverend Toribio Sabandija Quimita, was born in 1917 and ordained in a Protestant church, Iglesia Universal, in 1948. Quimita was geographically isolated, serving several small congregations on an island with few resources. Looking for support for his ministry, he turned to an international church directory, looked for Universal, and stumbled across the Universalist Church of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Those who were here last week will remember this is the oldest Universalist church in the United States and was the church started by so-called founder of Universalism in America, John Murray. He found this church and he reached out. The Gloucester congregation then connected him with the Universalist Service Committee. Yes, you heard that correctly, Universalist Service Committee. We'll talk about that later. And they began sending church materials that Quimita incorporated into his Christian education program. This so incensed the leadership of the Iglesia Universal that in 1954, Quimita was expelled from his ordained ministry. In response, he founded the Universalist Church of the Philippines, and several hundred members of his former congregations joined him. Quimita built an enduring relationship with the broader Universalist and Unitarian world. Sadly, his own relationship was cut short in 1988. We hear this account from his granddaughter, Melka Quimita, who writes, just weeks before he was to fly to the General Assembly, Quimita was murdered in his home by a right-wing paramilitary group. He was shot and his body burned along with the UUCP records, hymn books, and worship materials, which he was killed trying to protect. Quimita was a known peacemaker and a safe harbor for his rural congregants whose primary livelihood was laboring on farms and who were on the front lines of leftist insurgency against government security forces. Now, after the loss of Quimita, the church continued under the leadership of his daughter, the Reverend Rebecca Quimita Saenz, the first Filipino UU to study and complete a theological degree in the United States. She took the reins of the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Philippines when she returned from Meadville Lombard Theological School in the late 1990s. She is widely respected and takes pride in her leadership and mentoring of women clergy, teaching on feminism and carrying forward the human rights work of her father. As of 2020, the leadership has transitioned to ministers outside of the family, and the UU Church of the Philippines had 27 registered congregations and 2,000 members. I had mentioned this last week and realize now that probably this whole service could have used a trigger warning, so my apologies for this. These are not heavy topics that we talk about. But I had mentioned last week that it was not just those in the distant past who died as a result of their Unitarian or Universalist faith and what it compelled them to do. Here in our very recent past, we have the founder of Unitarian Universalism in the Philippines dying for his faith and the actions it compelled him to take. We note too the tragedy that when Reverend Kamada was referred to the Unitarian Service Committee instead of the denomination at large when he first reached out. In that small act, we can see how this one congregation in Gloucester was looking at partnership with this congregation in the Philippines, right? It was an act of service and not an act of togetherness, of being congregations of equal standing. And something that the article from the UU World did not state, which is that Kamada did not get the financial or human support he was hoping for from the denomination when he first approached them. This was a failure to support UU ministry in a different country and culture in ways that in hindsight, we wish we had, and we are grateful that this church continued to thrive despite the denomination's lackluster support. Now, this story bears a strong resemblance to the story here in the US that was our reading this morning that we heard Bob Day read for us. Our reading this morning from Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed highlighted the first recorded time that collectively our faith turned away from allowing itself to be changed and claimed by a Black Unitarian or Universalist minister. And I think it's important to note here as well that our examples this morning, both in the Philippines and the United States, were of ministers working to bring our faith into their own community. For this is not to say that there were not lay leaders who were also trying to do this work or did it beforehand. I would imagine that this happened as well, and it is just not recorded and documented in the way that ministerial contact got documented by our associations, and later written more about and written down in history. Brief aside and moving back. In 1860, Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed writes, "Was the first time but not the last time the Unitarian Association missed opportunities to support Unitarianism from growing and being present in the Black community in the United States." In fact, his book that our reading came from focuses mainly on two other Black Unitarian ministers who wanted to start churches within the Black community. Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown was born in 1875 in Jamaica. Raised a Methodist, realized he was Unitarian Universalist, attended also Meadville Lombard Theological School, and went on to establish Unitarian churches in both his home country of Jamaica and then in Harlem, New York. Neither of the churches he established became long-standing and indeed were struggling to take off. Now, in his analysis and reporting, Reverend Dr. Morrison Reed makes his own assessment of how Reverend Brown and his, like all of our own very humanness, contributed to his difficulties. But he is also very clear to say that the Unitarian Association, and indeed his colleagues, his white colleagues, never really gave Reverend Brown and his ministry a chance. Never really gave him the human or financial support he needed to be able to be successful in his ministry. And so his story is one of a missed opportunity, and is one where we have a minister who was always struggling and never able to devote enough time to his ministry because he also needed to make ends meet and support his family. Now, the second minister that Reverend Dr. Reed highlights has a bit of a different story and ending. The Reverend Lewis McGee was born in 1893 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Reverend McGee was also raised Methodist and realized he was a Unitarian and went to Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is in Chicago. McGee was particularly a humanist Unitarian. And in Chicago, Reverend McGee begins the Free Religious Fellowship in 1948. He is more successful than Reverend Brown was able to be, thanks to having the moral and financial support of the then president of Meadville Lombard Theological School. Though the Free Religious Fellowship, which was an intentionally Black Unitarian fellowship, under Reverend McGee's tenure, lost members after they had to move their physical location, it still exists today. McGee himself was also able to serve other Unitarian congregations, those that were majority white congregations, something which the Unitarian Association had named on record, an impossibility when Reverend Jackson first presented himself to them in 1860. Though the Unitarians were now more open to people of color serving in mostly white congregations, Reverend McGee had to serve first as an assistant minister and a minister of education before he was able to be a senior minister at a mostly white church, even though he had already started and led a Black Unitarian church. It is important for us to name, as we learned 2 weeks ago, that it was in 1951 that the Unitarian Association placed advertisements in states Unitarianism had not yet spread to, many here in the South, to help religious liberals and humanists identify one another and form fellowships. This is where this fellowship came from. And so we must note that it was not long before this time, in the 1940s and indeed early 1950s, that the same Unitarian Association intentionally did not fund at all or underfunded fellowships from serving both in Black communities here in the United States and in the Philippines. For this too is part of our shared history and helps us to understand and frame our origins as we look to our future possibilities and ground ourselves in our present reality. Our present reality as a multicultural, multi-generational fellowship. For we are now in a different place as a denomination and as a fellowship than we were in 1951. And yet still the tendencies in our society are present. So we ground ourselves in this history so that we can be in the messy, wonderful place that is full of terrifying and exciting change and possibility. Our wider and particular history can inform and ground us in inspirational and humbling ways. There is a small figurine of a pig with wings. It's actually sitting right in front of the tech table over there. I should have had it with me, but I forgot to. Oh, it's a cow. Thank you. Wrong barnyard animal, a cow with wings. Thank you. This is from a time when there was doubt this fellowship could do a new, big, hard thing. Someone during this discussion about the chains said, well, we'll do that when cows fly. And so now, you have this figurine to remind you that you did it. You have made big changes and done hard things, and can and will do them again. Because here in this fellowship, all creatures of the earth and sky can fly, right? Okay. Amen.